You were young. Maybe it was school, maybe it was your parents, someone praised you. You're so smart. You're the strong one. You always know what to do. It felt good at the time, like love, like value. But over time, it became pressure. You stopped asking questions because you didn't want to seem less smart. You stopped crying because you had to be the strong one. You stopped struggling because they said you always figure it out. That compliment became a cage. And now as an adult, you feel it in every hesitation, every time you're afraid to fail, every time you pretend to know what you're doing. You think you're broken, but really, you were just taught that your worth had conditions. That's a scar, one that hides behind thank you, one that shaped who you became without ever asking who you wanted to be. They gave you affection, but only when you behaved. A hug for good grades. Praise when you smiled. Silence when you were upset. Distance when you asked for too much. Love became something you had to earn, not something that just existed. So you learned how to shrink, how to perform, how to become exactly what they needed, just to feel wanted. You apologized too quickly. You laughed at things that weren't funny. You ignored your own needs to keep the peace. Because deep down, you were terrified of losing something that should have been unconditional. And now in relationships, you overthink. You chase. You give too much. And when someone actually loves you without condition, it feels suspicious, unfamiliar, unsafe. This is the scar of conditional love. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The one that teaches you to trade yourself away just to feel close to someone. And the saddest part? You were never hard to love. You were just surrounded by people who made you feel like you had to earn it. You didn't want to be difficult. You didn't want to make things worse. So instead of saying how you felt, you said, "I'm sorry." You said it when someone else was angry. You said it when your boundaries were crossed. You said it when you were hurt and still felt like the problem. And slowly, you learned something dangerous, that your feelings came second, that your peace wasn't worth the discomfort of others. So you apologized for needing time. You apologized for asking questions. You apologize just for existing too loudly. This scar runs deep because it doesn't look like pain. It looks like being polite. It looks like maturity. It looks like strength. But it's really fear, the fear of rejection, the fear of conflict, the fear that you're only loved when you're easy to be around. And now, even when you're safe, you still flinch at your own voice. Still soften every truth, still say sorry, when all you really want is to be understood. This isn't weakness. It's the scar of someone who survived by staying small. You had questions, but the room stayed quiet. No answers, no explanations, just discomfort. You were told not to talk back, to stop being nosy, to just let it go. And so you did, again and again, until silence became your survival tool. You stopped asking why things felt unfair. You stopped wondering why people hurt you and never said sorry. You stopped expecting closure because it never came. This silence taught you more than any answer ever did. That speaking up wasn't safe. That curiosity was a threat. That truth wasn't something you were allowed to touch. And now, You hesitate before saying what you really think. You worry that questions will make people leave. You flinch when someone asks you to open up because part of you still believes your voice is too much. This is the scar left by silence. Not absence of sound, but absence of permission. A world that taught you it was better to keep quiet, even when everything inside you was screaming to be heard. When you were younger, joy came naturally. Running through the yard, laughing too loud, being silly. But somewhere along the line, it became performance. You were told to finish your work first, told to stop playing and be serious, told that rest was a reward, not a right. And slowly, your joy became conditional. You stopped doing things just because. You started asking if you deserved a break. You started earning moments that should have been yours all along. Even now, as an adult, you hesitate before relaxing. You feel guilty when you rest. You overwork, overcommit, overachieve. And when you finally collapse, you wonder why it still doesn't feel good enough. This is the scar of transactional happiness. A childhood where joy was only allowed after effort. A world that taught you fun has to be paid for. But the truth is, joy was never supposed to be a prize. It was supposed to be part of being human. And you were supposed to know from the start that you didn't need to earn it. They called you strong, resilient, tough. They said it like a compliment, but you never had a choice. You were strong because no one was there, because falling apart wasn't an option, because you had to be. You picked yourself up after things no one apologized for. You swallowed feelings that would have made others uncomfortable. You smiled when you wanted to scream, and everyone praised you for it, for how well you held it together, for how mature you were, for surviving what you were never supposed to go through alone. But strength like that comes at a cost. It isolates you. Because when you're the strong one, people stop checking in. They assume you're fine. They don't see the exhaustion behind your eyes. This scar doesn't cry out. It looks like competence. It looks like grace. It looks like someone who never breaks. But deep down, you're tired. Tired of holding it all. Tired of pretending that being strong didn't hurt. And maybe one day, the strongest thing you'll ever do is finally let go. You weren't born quiet, or loud, or funny, or agreeable. You became that way because you had to. Maybe being funny kept the peace. Maybe staying quiet kept you safe. Maybe being easy to deal with meant you didn't get left behind. Whatever mask you learned to wear, it worked. People liked you. Teachers praised you. Friends leaned on you. Family left you alone. But deep down, you know it's not fully you. You wonder who you would have become if you didn't need to adapt so early. If you didn't have to play a part just to feel accepted. This is the scar of self-erasure, of growing up in a space that demanded performance, not presence, where love had rules, and you followed every one of them. Now, even when you're safe, you still catch yourself slipping into character, smiling too much, saying what you think they want to hear, staying agreeable even when it hurts. And you wonder, who am I when I'm not trying to be liked? You were still learning how to be a kid when the world asked you to grow up. Maybe it was a parent who leaned on you too heavily. Maybe it was a home full of noise, and you had to be the calm. Maybe it was chaos, loss, illness, divorce. And suddenly your childhood had an expiration date. You learned to be helpful, to be mature for your age, to make others comfortable even when you weren't. And people called you responsible, wise, strong. But no one asked what it cost you. You learned how to care for everyone else. But no one taught you how to care for yourself. You learned to minimize your needs, to not be a burden, to clean up the mess, even when you didn't make it. This is the scar of stolen childhood. It doesn't always look like trauma. Sometimes it looks like someone who always has it together. But inside, there's a kid still waiting for someone to say, "It's okay. You don't have to carry all of this." And maybe you still do. Something happened. Big, heavy, life-changing. But when you looked around, no one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and said, "You'll be fine. Don't overthink it. Other people have it worse." So you buried it, tried to move on, tried to convince yourself it wasn't that bad, but it was. You just weren't allowed to fall apart. You went to school, went to work, smiled when people asked how you were, and they called you strong. But inside, you were frozen in time, still living in the moment that no one helped you carry. This is the scar of the unvalidated crisis. It lingers in silence, in numbness, in the parts of you that don't make sense anymore. And sometimes it shows up years later, in panic attacks that have no obvious trigger, in tears you can't explain, in a deep exhaustion that never fully goes away. Because just because you survived something quietly doesn't mean it didn't leave a mark. It started small. Someone didn't text back. A parent looked disappointed. A teacher chose someone else. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking what it meant. You started assuming you were the problem. You told yourself not to bother people, not to try too hard, not to care too much, because if they really wanted you, you wouldn't have to. And slowly, rejection stopped being an event. It became a truth, a quiet, invisible weight. Now, when someone pulls away, you don't chase. You retreat. When someone's distant, you blame yourself. When someone's silent, your mind fills in the gaps with stories of not being good enough. You learn to be cautious with your joy, to hold your excitement in check, to prepare for the moment things fall apart, because they always have. This is the scar of internalized rejection. It convinces you to pull away before they do, to detach before you're abandoned, to shut the door from the inside before anyone can leave you behind. But here's the truth. You weren't rejected because you were unworthy. You were just hurt at the wrong time, by the wrong people, and taught to see every exit as a reflection of you. It's not. You deserve to stop running from closeness. You deserve to stop bracing for loss. You deserve to stay. There were rooms where your voice felt too loud, too sharp, too much. Maybe it was around family. Maybe it was in classrooms. Maybe it was just the way certain people looked at you, like your presence was a problem to manage. So you made yourself smaller. You adjusted, softened your tone, bit your tongue. You got good at reading the room, at being what people needed, at knowing when to step aside, even when you had something to say. And they called you easygoing, chill, low maintenance. But what they didn't see was the quiet tension under your skin, the way you swallowed your opinions like broken glass, the way you flinched when attention turned your way. Because shrinking became safety. And over time, you didn't just shrink in certain rooms, you shrunk in all of them. Now, when someone asks what you want, you freeze. Because you're so used to not being asked. Because for so long, what you wanted didn't matter. This is the scar of self-reduction, of learning to dim yourself so others could shine. But you were never meant to be a background character in your own life. You don't have to shrink anymore. You're allowed to take up space. You always were. They praised your awareness, your insight, your maturity. They didn't see that you were just trying to feel safe. Overthinking became your defense. You replayed conversations, not because you were curious, but because you were scared. You imagined every possible outcome, not because you were strategic, but because you didn't trust anything to go right. You learned to read people's faces like warning signs, to find hidden meaning in silence, to prepare for disappointment before it even showed up. And you got good at it. So good, they called it being wise beyond your years. But wisdom born from fear is just survival with a nicer name. You told yourself it made you smarter, that you were being responsible. But the truth is, you were carrying every possibility because no one ever helped you carry the present. Now you exhaust yourself trying to figure it all out. You struggle to be in the moment because your mind is always 10 steps ahead. You live in rehearsals just in case something goes wrong. This is the scar of constant hyper-awareness, the one that keeps you sharp but never lets you rest. And while overthinking might have protected you back then, it's okay to admit it's hurting you now. You were never supposed to live in your head full time. You were supposed to feel safe enough to just be. At first, the silence felt like peace. No more tears, no more panic, no more feeling like the world was ending. You thought maybe you were getting better, but really you were just numb. The pain didn't leave. It just got quieter. It buried itself under distractions, responsibilities, and quiet rituals of avoidance. You laughed, but it didn't reach your chest. You loved, but your heart stayed guarded. You showed up, but something inside of you didn't. And people saw that version of you and said, "Look how far you've come." But they didn't see the part of you frozen in time, the version of you stuck in the moment when it all became too much. Numbness isn't healing, it's survival. It's your mind pulling the emergency brake. It's your body saying, "We can't feel this right now. It's too dangerous." But over time, it becomes a scar, a hollow in the chest, a disconnection from your own life. You don't cry anymore, but not because it doesn't hurt. You just don't know how to feel safe enough to feel. And maybe the hardest part, learning how to come back, to thaw, to open, to feel again without falling apart, because healing isn't just quiet. Sometimes it's loud, messy, and painfully human, and that's okay. You learned early that smiling made things easier for them, not for you. You smiled to calm people down, to hide the tears, to diffuse tension in rooms that felt too sharp. And the more you smiled, the more they believed you were okay, the more they leaned on you, the more they forgot to ask what you needed. So you made it your personality. The one who's always fine, the one who jokes through pain, the one who's never the problem. But behind the smile, your jaw ached, your stomach tightened, your heart got quieter, because the smile became a shield. And like any armor, it got heavy. This is the scar of performative happiness. It tells you that your real emotions are a burden, that if you're not cheerful, you're not lovable. That honesty ruins the mood. So you wear the smile like a uniform. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take it off, to let someone see the storm behind it, to let yourself cry, rage, collapse, and still be worthy of love in the mess. You don't have to keep everyone else comfortable. You deserve to feel whole even when you're not okay. Maybe you're the perfectionist, the overachiever, the funny one, the loner, the workaholic. Whatever you called it, you wore it like a badge. It gave you control, structure, predictability. But it wasn't who you were. It was how you coped. You stayed busy to avoid stillness. You made people laugh so they wouldn't see your pain. You obsessed over details because chaos made you feel powerless. You avoided attachment because needing others felt unsafe. And the world rewarded you for it. They praised your drive, admired your independence, said you were so self-aware. But beneath the surface, you were exhausted, trapped inside an identity that was never yours to begin with. This is the scar of adaptive survival. When the thing that saved you starts to define you. When your coping becomes your mask. And one day you wake up and wonder, who am I when I'm not managing everything? Who am I when I don't have to survive? You're allowed to outgrow it, to put the armor down, to become someone softer, freer, less prepared for war. Because your personality isn't your pain. It's who you get to become when you're finally safe. You didn't choose to go it alone. Not really. But over time, it started to feel safer that way. You stopped asking for help because help didn't come. You stopped opening up because people didn't stay. You stopped leaning on anyone because every time you did, the weight came crashing back down on you. So you learned to rely only on yourself. You became the fixer, the planner, the I've got it handled person. You were proud of it, and people respected it. But behind that independence was a deep, aching loneliness, the kind you couldn't explain without sounding ungrateful, the kind that lingered in quiet moments and late nights, whispering, no one really knows you. This is the scar of self-reliance built on betrayal. When trust is broken enough times, solitude becomes a shield. But that shield, it's heavy. And now even when someone offers you support, you hesitate, you smile and say, I'm good. Not because you are, but because asking feels dangerous. Because part of you still believes that needing is weakness. But it's not. Needing others is human. Letting them in isn't failure. It's healing. You're not a burden. You're just someone who learned to survive without backup. But it's okay to unlearn that now. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. You told yourself you were just being realistic, just keeping it real, just holding yourself accountable. But the voice in your head wasn't honest. It was cruel. And it didn't sound like you at first. It sounded like the parent who said, "You can do better." The teacher who pointed out your mistakes, but never your progress. The friend who made jokes that cut deeper than they should have. Over time, you started repeating those voices, telling yourself you weren't enough, that if you failed, it was your fault, that if someone left, it was because of you. And worst of all, you believed it was the truth. You thought being hard on yourself was strength, that tearing yourself apart was the only way to grow. But growth doesn't bloom in shame. It withers. And that voice, the one that nitpicks, mocks, minimizes, it didn't make you better. It made you smaller. This is the scar of inherited self-judgment. You internalized it so deeply it felt like self-awareness. But it was really self-abandonment. You were never meant to be your own enemy. You were meant to be your first protector, your loudest advocate, your softest place to land. You can still be honest with yourself. But you don't have to be brutal. You don't have to be the echo of everyone who made you feel unworthy. You can be the voice that says, "I'm doing my best," and that's enough. You said sorry, even when it wasn't your fault, even when no one asked you to, even when all you did was exist. You apologized for taking up space, for expressing emotion, for having needs, for not being perfect. And people said you were polite, considerate, so mature for your age. But the truth was, you weren't being kind. You were trying to stay safe. Somewhere along the way, you learned that keeping the peace meant shrinking yourself, that if something went wrong, it was easier, safer, to blame yourself first, to be the one who smooths it over, who fixes the tension, who disappears a little so no one gets upset. This is the scar of preemptive guilt. It teaches you that your presence is disruptive, that your truth is inconvenient, that your role is to soften every edge in the room, even the ones that hurt you. But apologies born from fear aren't kindness. They're survival. And you were never meant to be at war with your own worth. You don't need to say sorry for taking up space, for having boundaries, for telling the truth. You don't have to be small to feel safe. You don't have to apologize just for being you. You're so responsible. You're the strong one. You're always so calm. They meant it as compliments. But slowly, those compliments became rules. And those rules became a cage. You kept being responsible, even when it burned you out. You stayed strong, even when you were breaking inside. You stayed calm, even when you wanted to scream. Because the moment you let any of it slip, people noticed. Not with concern, but with disappointment. You weren't just allowed to be you anymore. You were a role, a label, a story that others had already written, so you stayed within it. You overfunctioned, you stayed agreeable, you stayed predictable, and no one asked if you were happy because they assumed you already were. This is the scar of identity praise, the subtle trap of being seen only for your usefulness, where growth starts to feel like betrayal, where change feels like you're letting everyone down. But here's the truth. You're allowed to evolve, to shift, to outgrow even the things that earned you love. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that keeps you small. The praise wasn't the problem. It was the silence that followed when you needed to be someone else. And now you get to choose who you become next. It was intense, all-consuming, like gravity, pulling you towards someone who made your heart race and your mind spin. You thought it was connection, that the unpredictability meant passion, that the emotional highs and lows were signs of depth, not damage. But deep down, something felt off. You were anxious more than you were happy. You questioned yourself more than you felt secure. You kept trying to fix it, thinking it was love. What you didn't know was that your nervous system was recognizing a pattern, one you'd lived through before. Unpredictability felt familiar. Instability felt like home. So when someone kept you guessing, you didn't run. You adapted. You chased their validation like a prize and called the ache inside of you chemistry. This is the scar of relational reenactment, where your body responds to chaos, not with fear, but with craving. Because when love has always come with conditions, you mistake peace for boredom, you mistake safety for emptiness, you mistake quiet for absence. But love that hurts isn't passion, it's programming. And you deserve more than a connection that costs you your peace. Real chemistry won't leave you anxious at 2 a.m. It won't punish you with silence. It won't teach you to earn affection like a prize. Real love feels like calm, like clarity, like coming home to yourself. You kept hoping they'd realize that one day they'd say sorry, that the scales would balance. Finally, you waited and waited for karma, for justice, for closure, for something to make it feel worth it. But it never came. They moved on like nothing happened, smiling, thriving, while you were left holding the pieces. And everyone else, they didn't seem to notice. They didn't know what it took for you to stay silent, how heavy it was to be the bigger person. So you carried your pain quietly, because the world told you that forgiveness is noble, that letting go is strength. But they never warned you that justice might not arrive, that healing sometimes comes without an apology. This is the scar of unresolved harm, the one that whispers, it shouldn't have ended this way. They should have paid for what they did. Why am I the only one still bleeding? And yet, here you are, still standing. Not because it was fair, but because you made peace with the unfairness. That's not weakness. That's not letting them win. That's choosing to move forward without waiting for someone else to make it right. Because maybe justice didn't come, but you did, and that's more powerful than they'll ever know. You keep ending up in the same kinds of relationships, the same arguments, the same feelings of, here we go again. And for the longest time, you told yourself, this is just who I am. I guess I attract the wrong people. Maybe I'm the problem. But what if it wasn't about you? What if it was about the map your nervous system built to survive? You learned early how to navigate danger, how to please, avoid, defend, or disappear. And those patterns, they became part of your wiring. So now, even when you walk into a new room, you scan for old threats. Even when someone is kind, you prepare for withdrawal. Even when it's safe, Your body braces like it's not. This is the scar of repetition, mistaken for identity. It tells you that you're just difficult, that love isn't meant to last, that conflict means you failed. But what you're really experiencing is a nervous system stuck in defense mode. And the worst part, it's invisible. Because you've been doing it so long, it feels normal, automatic, like breathing. But your survival mode is not your personality. It's not your destiny. And it's not too late to rewire. You are not broken. You are patterned. And patterns can change. They called you resilient, said you were strong, admired how you never let anything break you. But they didn't see the cracks, the nights you fell apart, alone, the weight you carried without complaint, because complaining never changed anything. You weren't strong because you wanted to be. You were strong because you had no choice. Because when things fell apart, you were the one who held them together. Because when others got to collapse, you became the glue. And somewhere along the way, that became your role. The one who doesn't cry, the one who always shows up, the one who takes care of everything and asks for nothing. But strength, without softness, becomes a cage. You begin to fear vulnerability. You start to believe that resting is weakness, that asking for help is failure, that being seen in pain makes you less. This is the scar of over-identifying with strength. It makes you stoic when you really need comfort. It makes you silent when you really need to scream. But you're allowed to set it down, to not be the strong one for once, to fall apart and still be worthy. Because true strength isn't never breaking. It's knowing when it's time to finally let yourself rest. Somewhere along the line, you learned there were good emotions and bad ones. Joy, allowed. Gratitude, encouraged but sadness. Inconvenient, anger, dangerous, fear, weakness. So you trimmed your emotional vocabulary. You smiled when you were anxious, laughed when you were hurt, went quiet when you were furious, and people thanked you for it. They said you were easy to be around. So mature, so chill. But inside, your feelings didn't vanish. They just got shoved into storage, buried under layers of shame and guilt. They didn't die. They fermented. They sharpened until one day they started leaking out in other ways. Anxiety in the silence, resentment behind kindness, tears that came out of nowhere. This is the scar of emotional editing, of internalizing the belief that only certain feelings are lovable, that the real you, the whole, messy, honest you, is too much. But emotions don't make you broken. They make you human. And you were never supposed to be palatable at the cost of being real. It's not your job to be digestible. It's your right to feel everything, fully, even the ugly parts, especially those. They're just as worthy of light. You say sorry when someone bumps into you. You apologize for speaking up, for needing clarity, for just being there. It slips out before you even realize. A reflex, not a reflection. A safety mechanism, not humility. You say sorry to avoid conflict, to shrink the tension, to soften your own presence. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that the safest version of you is the one who takes the blame. This isn't politeness. It's protection. The habit formed when you were younger. Maybe someone exploded when you made a mistake. Maybe no one ever apologized to you. Maybe you watched people withdraw love whenever you asserted yourself. So sorry became your way of staying safe, of holding on to connection, of keeping peace in places that didn't offer it freely. But here's what they don't tell you. Over apologizing chips away at your self-worth. It rewrites your role in every interaction, makes you responsible for things that were never yours to carry. You're allowed to be wrong, yes, but you're also allowed to exist without guilt, to take up space, to speak honestly, to feel without justification. Your presence is not a problem. You don't need to earn the right to be here. Not with an apology. Not anymore. You used to dream loud, speak big, move like someone who believed they belonged. But then someone flinched, or rolled their eyes, or told you to be realistic. So you dimmed yourself, softened your voice, held back your joy, not because you wanted to, but because you thought that's what they needed. You let others shine while you stepped out of frame. You let others speak while you swallowed your brilliance. You told yourself, this isn't the time. I don't want to make them uncomfortable. I'll wait my turn. But that turn never came because you were too good at disappearing, too practiced at making room, too afraid that being fully seen would make someone else feel small. This is the scar of quiet self-erasure. The kind you do so gradually you forget it's happening, until one day you look around and realize there's no space left for you. But here's the truth. Your light doesn't dim anyone else's. Your voice doesn't silence theirs. Your growth doesn't threaten. It inspires. You were never too much. They were just too used to people who knew how to shrink. Not anymore. Expand. Take up space. Become too loud to ignore. You thought you had high standards, that you were pushing yourself to be better, that nothing less than perfection was acceptable. But those standards weren't yours. They were survival blueprints. A parent who only praised achievement. A teacher who pointed out what was missing, never what was there. A culture that taught you your value was tied to productivity, performance, and pain tolerance. So you kept raising the bar, never satisfied, always chasing the next win, the next metric, the next impossible goal. And when you didn't meet it, you didn't rest. You punished yourself, told yourself it wasn't enough. You weren't enough. This is the scar of internalized pressure, where external expectations get mistaken for self-worth, where rest feels like failure, where gentleness feels like laziness. But standards built on fear aren't goals, they're chains. And perfection is not the same thing as growth. You're allowed to want more for yourself, but you don't have to bleed for it. You don't have to prove your value through burnout. You don't have to earn love through achievement. You were enough before the awards, before the grades, before the praise. And you still are. You forgave them, told yourself it was the right thing to do, that you were being the bigger person, that healing meant moving on. But something inside didn't feel right. The weight didn't lift. The pain didn't fade. The memory still stung. Not like a scar, but like an open wound wrapped in a smile. You didn't forgive because you were at peace. You forgave because you were tired, because they pressured you, because everyone else said you should. So you swallowed your anger, your grief, your need to be heard, and called it growth. But that's not forgiveness. That's suppression. This is the scar of premature closure, when peace is forced before it's real, when forgiveness is offered as a performance, not a release. You were told that holding on to pain was poison, but no one told you that rushing past it can be too. Forgiveness is not a race. It's not a gift you owe. It's not a fast pass to healing. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, I'm not ready yet. And that's okay. You deserve the space to feel before you let go. Not because you're bitter, but because your pain mattered. You were always the one who stayed after to clean up, the one who made the plans, took the blame, sent the check-in text first. You called it kindness, generosity, maybe even loyalty. But deep down, it wasn't just about caring. It was about staying needed. Because if you were useful, you couldn't be abandoned. If you were helpful, they wouldn't leave. If you solved their problems, maybe they'd never notice how broken you felt. So you overextended, said yes when your body screamed no, showed up even when it hurt. You were the emotional first responder, the one who showed up with tools, tissues, and solutions, even when you were bleeding yourself. People praised you for it. You're so reliable. I don't know what I'd do without you. But what you heard was, if I stop helping, I lose my place here. This is the scar of conditional belonging. When your presence feels earned, not granted, when your value becomes currency, not connection. And the worst part, you never gave yourself the same care. You built a home in other people's storms, but never let anyone into yours. But you deserve more than transactional love. You deserve to be chosen when you have nothing to offer, to be embraced not for what you do, but for who you are when you stop performing. Let them love you without the toolbox in your hand. If they only show up when you're fixing things, they were never really there for you. You were always the calm one, the level-headed one, the one who didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't make things worse. People admired it. You're so composed. You're so mature for your age. But what they didn't see was that your calm was a coping mechanism. You didn't choose to be chill. You learned that if you panicked, no one would help. If you cried, it would be used against you. If you got angry, things would get worse. So you trained your face to stay neutral. You flattened your voice. You silenced your instincts. You became an expert at shrinking your reactions to avoid escalation. This wasn't peace. It was self-protection, a strategy, a shield. Because when the people around you were volatile, your safety depended on being predictable. This is the scar of performative calm, the kind that looks like strength, but feels like silence, the kind that earns you praise, but costs you access to your own emotions. And over time, you started confusing numbness for maturity, stillness for stability, control for character. But you're allowed to shake, to scream, to be messy and loud and overwhelmed. You don't have to hold the room together anymore. That was never your job. Real calm isn't about suppression. It's about safety. And safety begins when you're finally allowed to feel everything you had to hide. They made you believe things about yourself that were never true. that you were selfish, that you were dramatic, that your needs were a burden. But those weren't your reflections. They were projections, pain they didn't want to deal with, insecurities they refused to own, flaws they couldn't bear to see in themselves, so they handed them to you. Every time they messed up, you became the problem. Every time you spoke up, you were starting something. Every time you pulled away, you were cold, mean, ungrateful. So you looked in the mirror and started to believe it. You questioned your reality, gaslit yourself before they could, apologized for things you never did, felt guilt for emotions you couldn't help. This is the scar of inherited shame, of internalized narratives that were never yours to carry. But the longer you hold them, the more they reshape you, until one day your reflection feels foreign. Not because you changed, but because you were rewritten by someone else's fear. It's time to smash that mirror, to return every label they pinned to you out of their own cowardice. You are not selfish for having boundaries, not dramatic for having emotions, not ungrateful for wanting more. You are not who they needed you to be. You're who you were before they distorted the glass. They tested your limits, pushed your boundaries, watched how far they could go, how much they could take. Before you broke, they called it just a joke, said you were too sensitive. They poked, prodded, withheld, then flooded you with kindness just to see what you'd do. Every reaction became data. Every silence was a green light. Every second chance was a signal that you'd tolerate more. But you didn't realize what was happening. Not at first, because it didn't look like manipulation. It looked like chaos, like confusion, like hot and cold, love and withdrawal, guilt and reward. They were studying your thresholds, figuring out what hurt you, what scared you, what made you stay. This is the scar of psychological experimentation, not in a lab, not in a study, but in real life, where you were the subject and they were the ones holding the clipboard. And you adapted. You got quieter, more careful, more strategic about how much of yourself you gave, because nothing ever felt safe for long. But you were never irrational. You were responding to conditioning, to patterns, to a system where your pain was treated like a puzzle to solve, not something to hold. You didn't fail the experiment. You survived it. And now you get to build a world where no one tests your worth like that again. You prided yourself on being kind, empathetic, understanding. You saw people's wounds before they even showed them, made excuses for their cruelty, gave them the benefit of the doubt again and again. They had a rough childhood. They didn't mean it. They're just going through a lot right now. But little by little, your kindness became self-abandonment. You stayed in situations that drained you, tolerated disrespect because they didn't know better. You called it compassion, but it was also fear of being cold, of being selfish, of being the one who walks away. So instead, you stayed. You smiled while breaking. You offered grace to people who never offered you basic decency. This is the scar of weaponized compassion, when your empathy is turned inward like a blade. Not because you're weak, but because somewhere along the line, you learned that love means sacrifice. But kindness without boundaries isn't love. It's martyrdom. And compassion doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. You can be kind and walk away. You can care and protect your peace. You can love people and still say, this isn't good for me. Kindness should never cost you your sanity or your soul. There were things you wanted to say, moments you wanted to scream, to cry, to tell the truth. But every time you opened your mouth, you saw it. That look, the one that said, don't make things harder, don't ruin the moment, don't be a burden, so you swallowed it. The truth, the pain, the questions that never got answers, and after a while, silence became your default. Not because you didn't have anything to say, but because you stopped believing your voice would be met with care. They told you you were mature for staying quiet, that you were easy to love because you weren't too emotional. They called it strength, but it felt like erasure. This is the scar of strategic silence, the kind you build layer by layer until you can't remember the last time you spoke freely. You don't just fear being misunderstood. You fear being understood and rejected anyway. So now even when someone asks what's wrong, you hesitate. Even when they say, I want to know, you wonder if they really mean it. But here's the thing. Silence kept you safe when nothing else could. It was your armor. But armor gets heavy, and it was never meant to be worn forever. You don't owe anyone your story, but you do deserve a life where your truth doesn't have to hide, where your voice isn't just heard, it's welcomed. You weren't always like this. There was a time when you were louder, freer, messier. You asked questions without fear. You said what you meant. You showed up as your whole self before you were taught which parts were too much. And slowly, they started handing out rewards. Smiles when you stayed quiet. Affection when you agreed. Praise when you played small. So you adapted. You gave them the version of you that made them most comfortable. The agreeable one, the non-threatening one, the one who never asked for too much, never made things awkward, never pushed back. You became their favorite shape, not because it was who you were, but because it was who they approved. This is the scar of performative identity. When love becomes conditional, when praise feels like payment for compliance, when authenticity starts to feel dangerous. You told yourself it was safer this way, that being accepted was better than being real. But deep down, you miss yourself. The version that danced without thinking, the version that took up space without apologizing, the version that didn't contort to fit someone else's frame. You are not a performance. You are not a curated personality made for other people's comfort. You are a full, unedited story, and the people who truly care will never ask you to rewrite your truth just to keep their love. You didn't know any different. What you lived with wasn't questioned. It was routine. The tension in the air, the yelling behind closed doors, the silence that followed. You just called it home. You assumed everyone walked on eggshells. That love always came with conditions. That affection had to be earned. So you adjusted. You learned to read moods like maps, to shrink your needs, to become useful, invisible, agreeable. You called it maturity, responsibility, being the strong one. But years later, you find yourself freezing in calm situations. You apologize for being emotional. You flinch at kindness, waiting for it to turn sharp. You overthink every text, every silence, every shift in tone, because your nervous system never unlearned what it once had to accept. This is the scar of normalized dysfunction. When pain is renamed patience, when emotional survival is mislabeled personality, when trauma wears the mask of tradition. But just because you grew used to it doesn't mean it was okay. And just because they never apologized doesn't mean it didn't hurt. You don't have to keep calling it normal. You can call it what it was: unfair, unkind, unhealed. And now, you get to decide what normal should have felt like: safety, softness, peace that doesn't have to be earned. There was a moment, maybe quiet, maybe subtle, when things finally calmed down. No more fires to put out, no one yelling, no one ignoring you, just stillness. And instead of feeling relief, you felt nothing, unsettled, anxious, like something must be wrong. Because you were used to chaos, used to turbulence, used to solving, soothing, surviving. So when the noise stopped, it didn't feel safe. It felt unfamiliar. This is the scar of a nervous system trained by conflict, one that doesn't know how to rest, that interprets calm as a warning, that searches for threats in silence. You've been in survival mode for so long, you forgot what it feels like to exist without tension in your shoulders, without checking everyone's mood, without holding your breath just in case. And now, peace feels like boredom, stillness feels like danger, happiness feels like a setup, but it's not. It's what your body was never given a chance to believe was real. You are allowed to feel safe without earning it. You're allowed to rest without being on alert. You don't have to create drama just to feel alive. That quiet feeling, that's not emptiness. That's what freedom sounds like when you're hearing it for the first time. You kept the peace, even when it cost your voice. You kept the connection, even when it came with conditions. You stayed soft, small, agreeable, because rocking the boat meant risking everything. So you folded, bit your tongue, nodded when you disagreed, laughed when it wasn't funny. You thought you were being wise, that keeping the relationship mattered more than being right, that avoiding conflict meant you were emotionally intelligent. But it wasn't wisdom. It was fear, the kind that's learned, practiced, reinforced. Because once speaking your truth came with punishment. Once being honest meant rejection. Once your needs were too much for someone who didn't know how to hold them. So you betrayed yourself in the name of safety. Not once, not twice, but again and again, until it became automatic. This is the scar of self-erasure, where love is earned by disappearing, where peace is purchased by silence, where safety feels like hiding. But here's the truth. You shouldn't have to abandon yourself to belong. You shouldn't have to censor your truth to keep someone close. The people who love you will never ask you to shrink to fit their comfort. You were not born to be tolerated. You were born to be seen, fully, loud, honest, uncompromised. You don't need to buy safety anymore. You just need to stop selling yourself for it. They told you some things were impure: desire, doubt, anger. Your questions, your instincts, your body. So you folded your hands and bit your tongue, confessed feelings you hadn't even had, apologized for being human. They called it guidance. But it was shame, disguised as salvation. It wasn't about belief, it was about control. They taught you to fear yourself, to see your curiosity as a threat, to believe that your worth was tied to your obedience. And every time you slipped, you didn't just feel guilty, you felt unclean, unworthy, unlovable. This is the scar of spiritual manipulation, where faith is used as a leash, where love comes with surveillance, where purity becomes a prison. They made you carry a sin that was never yours and called it humility. They silenced your questions and called it devotion. They broke your spirit and said it was for your soul. But hear this, you were never too much. You were never unworthy. You were never a sin. You were someone they feared would wake up. And now you are. They didn't say, "We'll only love you if you succeed." But it was there, in the silence when you failed, in the praise that only came with awards, in the way they lit up at your report card but dimmed when you cried. So you learned the rule. Be impressive or be invisible. Be useful or be replaced. Make them proud or make yourself disappear. You weren't chasing dreams. You were chasing permission to be enough. Every accomplishment felt like an entry ticket, temporary, fragile, easily revoked. This is the scar of conditional affection, where love feels like a prize you win, not a place you come home to, where rest feels like failure, where your worth is always in motion, never settled. And even now you struggle to stop, to breathe, to let go. Because if you're not excelling, you fear you're nothing. But you were never meant to live life as a resume. You don't have to outperform your pain. You don't have to be brilliant to deserve peace. The real work, learning to stand still and still believe you belong. You were a different version of yourself at home, not because you wanted to be, but because you had to be. The responsible one, the peacekeeper, the golden child, or the ghost. You learned quickly. Some feelings weren't allowed. Some truths couldn't be spoken. Some parts of you had to be hidden to keep the air from breaking. So you became what they needed: a distraction, a fixer, a mirror. Whatever it took to keep the tension down and the love coming in scraps. And when people say family is everything, you flinch because you know the price of that loyalty. You've paid it in silence. This is the scar of familial performance, of playing a role so well that you forgot who you were before the script was handed to you, where connection came with conditions, where being loved meant being useful, not yourself. Even now you find yourself playing characters in new rooms, over-explaining, over-functioning, over-editing your truth to avoid triggering old landmines. But here's the truth. You weren't hard to love. You were just surrounded by people who didn't know how. You don't have to keep auditioning for acceptance in a story you never asked to be written into. You can take off the mask and still be whole. You didn't just receive attention. You learned to scan it, analyze it, decide if it was safe. Because praise wasn't just praise. It came with expectation, with pressure, with the invisible contract. If I notice you, you owe me. It came from teachers who lifted you up, then pushed you past your limits, from adults who said you were mature, then treated you like a therapist, from partners who adored you until you stopped performing. So now even kind words feel suspicious. A compliment makes you shrink. A spotlight makes you sweat. Not because you don't want love, but because you've only known love with strings attached. This is the scar of conditional validation, where admiration feels like a trap, where being seen never felt separate from being used, where you learn to hide just enough to feel safe. But here's the truth. Not all attention is dangerous. Not all affection is bait. You don't have to earn softness with sacrifice. You don't have to fear being noticed. The next time someone looks at you with kindness, remember, that look isn't a hook. It might just be a mirror. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be distant. You became distant because connections started to feel dangerous. Every time you opened up, something chipped away at your trust. A secret spilled, a confidence mocked, a vulnerability used as ammo later. So you built walls, quietly, carefully, not with bricks, but with sarcasm, distraction, perfectionism, detachment, anything to protect the parts of you that kept getting bruised. At first, it felt powerful, safe, in control. But over time, that safety turned into isolation, because walls don't just keep harm out, they keep intimacy out too. Love can't reach what it can't see, and you've been behind glass for so long that even you forgot what's on the other side. This is the scar of protective loneliness, where silence became a shield, where independence became a disguise for fear, where needing no one became your only way to survive. But you're allowed to open the window again, even a crack. Let someone in slowly. Let softness return like sunlight on cold stone. You built the walls to protect yourself. Now you can choose to build a door. You weren't given a childhood. You were given responsibilities, pressure, a front row seat to the mess adults couldn't clean up. Maybe you raised your siblings. Maybe you managed your parents' emotions. Maybe you just learned early that crying was inconvenient and needing things made you a problem. So you grew up fast. Not by choice, by survival. You learned to read the room before you even learned to spell. You learned to say, "I'm fine," before anyone asked. You became competent, composed, tired. This is the scar of premature adulthood, where being mature for your age wasn't a compliment. It was a consequence, where you wore stability like armor, where no one saw the child still hiding inside the grown-up. And even now, joy feels foreign. Play feels pointless. You struggle to relax because there's always something that needs fixing. But you deserve softness, even if no one gave it to you. You deserve play, even if you missed it the first time. You deserve to grow, not just up, but backward too. To reclaim the parts of you that were skipped over in the rush to become strong. You don't have to carry everyone anymore. It's okay to rest your shoulders. The world will keep turning, even if you lie down for a while. You laughed and someone told you to quiet down. You smiled and someone asked what you were hiding. You celebrated and someone reminded you it wouldn't last. So you stopped reaching for joy with both hands, started looking over your shoulder every time things felt good, waited for the crash after every high. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that happiness was suspicious, that good moments had strings attached, that joy was something to be earned, not something you could just feel. This is the scar of emotional conditioning, where joy came second to survival, where relief felt unsafe, where excitement was a setup. You became so used to disappointment that hope started to feel foolish. You kept your happiness small, just in case it got taken away. Even now, when life gives you a quiet, good thing, you brace for impact. You sabotage it. You downplay it. But here's the truth. Joy isn't a trick. It isn't selfish. It isn't naive. It's fuel. It's resistance. It's yours. And you don't have to apologize for holding it close. You're allowed to laugh fully, love deeply, feel joy loudly, not because it's guaranteed to last, but because you're finally free enough to feel it. You didn't always feel broken. You were taught to pick yourself apart, taught to believe that beauty had rules, and you weren't following them. It started with a comment, a comparison, a glance that lingered too long, or not long enough, and suddenly, your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a project, a problem, a negotiation. They sold you mirrors with cracks in them and told you the flaws were your fault. So you stood under fluorescent lights, pinching, sucking in, covering up, learning to hate parts of you that were never meant to be hated, smiling for photos you'd tear apart later. This is the scar of image conditioning, where confidence feels like rebellion, where beauty becomes a performance, where mirrors are weapons, not reflections. Even now, the criticism echoes louder than compliments. You look at yourself like you're reviewing a stranger, zooming in on what needs to be fixed instead of who is looking back. But here's the truth. You were never broken. You were distorted by a world that profits off your insecurity. You don't owe anyone pretty. You don't need permission to take up space. Your worth isn't measured in filters, symmetry, or silence. That mirror, it doesn't define you. You do. You were praised for being smart, gifted, exceptional. But what they didn't see was how lonely that made you. While other kids played, you solved. While others daydreamed, you analyzed. You understood things quickly, but no one understood you. They called you mature, but rarely asked how you were really feeling. They expected perfection and got confused when you cracked under the pressure. This is the scar of intellectual isolation, where intelligence becomes a spotlight that blinds, not warms, where being ahead means falling behind in connection, where your brain was celebrated, but your heart was left waiting in the hallway. Even now, your worth feels tied to performance. You struggle to ask for help because you're supposed to know better. You second guess your emotions because logic was always the priority. But intelligence is not immunity. Brilliance doesn't mean you don't bleed. You can be articulate and anxious, analytical and overwhelmed, wise and still wounded. You're not here to be impressive. You're here to be whole. And the smartest thing you'll ever do is learn how to let yourself be human. You weren't always the strong one. You became that way because no one else was allowed to fall apart. So you stepped in, you held it down, you got good at fixing, managing, carrying, because someone had to. At first, it was noble. You were the helper, the rock, the one people leaned on when things fell apart. But over time, that role became a costume, and eventually, a cage. You stopped talking about your own pain because people expected you to be fine. You stopped asking for help because you thought strength meant self-sufficiency. You forgot what it felt like to just be, without proving your usefulness to everyone around you. This is the scar of role entrapment, where personality becomes performance, where value is measured by utility, where love is earned through labor. Psychologists call this ego identity foreclosure. When someone forms their entire identity too early based on a single role and never gets the chance to ask, is this actually me? Or is this just who I had to become to survive? It happens in childhood, the caretaker child, the mediator, the overachiever, the emotional sponge. It happens in adulthood too. You're the dependable one at work, the reliable friend, the one who never needs anything. But the truth is, you do. You always have. And the longer you stay in the role, the more you disappear behind it. Until one day, you wake up exhausted. Not from doing too much, but from never being allowed to be anything else. But here's the truth. No one told you. You are not a function. You are not a job title. You are not a support beam holding up everyone else's story. You are a full human being with softness, needs, cracks, curiosity. And you don't need to earn rest by breaking. Let the mask down. Let someone carry you. Let the identity go so you can finally meet yourself. They told you it ran in the family, the temper, the silence, the sadness no one talked about. They said things like, "That's just how we are," as if pain were a family heirloom passed down like furniture. You watched people crumble and recover and crumble again, and you started to wonder if that fate was already wired into you. So when you felt anxiety creep in, when the anger bubbled under your skin, when the apathy hit like a wave, you didn't question it. You absorbed it. Because if your bloodline had already written the story, who were you to fight the plot? This is the scar of genetic fatalism, where you mistake biology for inevitability, where inherited traits become personal prisons. But here's what no one told you. Genes are not guarantees. You are not a passenger in your own brain. Yes, you may inherit vulnerability, but you also inherit resilience. Psychologists call this epigenetics, the study of how trauma, behavior, and environment can turn genes on and off. In other words, your story isn't written in stone, it's written in pencil, and you hold the eraser. You can choose different coping mechanisms, different language, different boundaries, different endings. You can be the interruption in a generational pattern that everyone else accepted as truth. Your parents' silence doesn't have to become yours. Your uncle's rage doesn't have to move through you. Your grandmother's depression doesn't have to nest in your rib cage. You are not cursed. You are not broken. You are not bound to repeat the past. You are a rewrite in progress, and that is power. You told yourself you were over it. You weren't angry anymore. You'd moved on. But then someone said something, a tone, a look, a word, and suddenly you were right back there. Not because you're weak, not because you're dramatic, but because your healing was never healing. It was hiding. You got good at avoiding the triggers. not at releasing them. You changed your environment, but kept the same internal wars. You talked about the trauma like it was someone else's story. Detached, distant, safe. This is the scar of false resolution, where survival gets misdiagnosed as peace, where people confuse your composure with recovery, where healing becomes a performance, not a process. Psychologists call this emotional bypassing, a form of self-protection where we intellectualize pain instead of feeling it. It sounds like, I'm fine. It doesn't bother me anymore. I've forgiven them. But your body remembers. In the tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the way you shut down before you even realize what you're reacting to. Healing isn't silence. It isn't absence of pain. It's integration. It's learning to hold the memory without becoming it. It's being able to tell your story without your nervous system sounding the alarm. You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to smile through the sting. You don't have to explain away your wounds. You're allowed to still be hurting. You're allowed to heal in layers. You're allowed to be a work in progress without apologizing for the mess. Real healing is slow, honest, messy, and always worth it. You got good at organizing pain, not healing it, organizing it, neatly filing memories into drawers labeled too much, not now, maybe later. You turned heartbreak into bullet points, red flags into footnotes, trauma into timelines you could reference without actually feeling them. Because feeling them, that would have broken something, and you didn't have time to fall apart. So you intellectualized, categorized, archived, until your brain looked like a therapist's office, but your heart looked like a locked basement. This is the scar of compartmentalization, a defense mechanism dressed as emotional intelligence, where insight replaces integration, where self-awareness becomes a cage. You can talk about your pain in perfect detail, but still feel completely disconnected from it. You can narrate your life like a podcast and never cry during the episodes. Because when survival was the goal, emotional efficiency kept you safe. But now, it's keeping you stuck. Therapists call this high-functioning trauma, where you're calm on the surface but drowning underneath the paperwork. Even now, you give the right answers in hard conversations. You know how to sound healed, without actually being healed. But healing isn't a spreadsheet. It's not a set of organized insights. It's tears on paperwork. It's shaking in the middle of a monologue you thought you'd mastered. It's finally feeling what you've only ever explained. You can keep the file cabinet, but don't forget, some things need to be held, not just filed. You weren't born agreeable. You became agreeable. Because rejection stung too much. Because approval felt like oxygen. Because being liked felt safer than being real. So you morphed. Smiled more. Talked less. Made yourself small in the places you wanted to be seen. Just enough to fit into their version of acceptable. You became who they needed you to be. The funny one. The smart one. The chill one. A performance so smooth even you forgot it was an act. This is the scar of self-betrayal through social adaptation, where survival meant masking, where fitting in felt like a necessity, not a choice, where you adjusted, edited, and edited until the original version of you got buried under other people's preferences. Psychologists call this false self syndrome, where your real identity becomes eclipsed by a socially constructed persona. It's not lying, it's not manipulation, it's protection, but it comes at a cost. You start to feel like a guest in your own life. People praise you for qualities that don't feel authentic. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh when something hurts. You call it getting along, but it's really just vanishing in plain sight. Even now, you second guess your reactions. You scan the room before finishing a sentence. You wonder, will they still like me if I stop performing? Here's the truth. The real you, the raw, unfiltered, complicated you, they were never too much. They were just never given a safe place to land. Start small. I know that feels scary. A truth that feels heavy. A moment where you say what you actually mean and survive it. You're not here to be liked by everyone. You're here to be you, unedited. They said you were easy to be around, that you were always so calm, so unbothered, so chill. But inside you weren't calm. You were numb, not relaxed, just disconnected, not peaceful, just distant enough from your own feelings that you couldn't be hurt by them. This is the scar of emotional shutdown, a nervous system response mistaken for a personality trait. The freeze response, not fight, not flight, but the quiet collapse, the invisible panic. It happens when crying never worked, when speaking up caused more harm, when asking for help felt like shouting into a void. So you stopped reacting, stopped needing, stopped hoping, and people called that maturity, balance, zen. They didn't see it was a form of disappearance. You learned to leave your body without ever walking away. Psychologists call this fawning's cousin, a type of dissociation where you flatten your presence to avoid conflict, disappointment, or danger. Even now, you find yourself spacing out mid-conversation, forgetting what you feel until it bubbles out sideways, avoiding your own reflection, not out of vanity, but out of absence. But here's the truth. That calm isn't you. It's armor. It's the final resort of a nervous system that stopped trusting the world to hold it. You deserve better than survival mode. You deserve to feel, even if it's messy. You deserve to return to yourself, not just exist beside yourself. Healing won't look like calm. It'll look like shaking, like crying for reasons that don't make sense, like finally feeling the weight of everything you've been carrying and choosing to feel it anyway. Because peace isn't silence, it's presence. You had things to say, feelings to share, questions that didn't fit neatly into other people's answers. But each time you opened your mouth, you were talked over, corrected, mocked, dismissed. So you stopped speaking. Not all at once, just a little quieter each time, until silence felt safer than truth, until your opinions lived in your chest instead of the room, until you became someone who waited to be asked instead of someone who simply spoke. This is the scar of self-censorship, a trauma response that teaches you your voice is a liability. Psychologists call it learned voicelessness. It's common in children raised in invalidating environments and adults who've been repeatedly told their truth is too much, too dramatic, or wrong. You start editing yourself in real time. You replay conversations hours later, not because you regret what you said, but because you wonder if you were allowed to say it at all. Even now, when you feel a truth rising in your throat, you swallow it. You call it timing, you call it maturity, but really it's just fear wearing a polite face. But here's the truth: your voice matters, even if it shakes, even if no one agrees, even if it disrupts the peace you never truly felt part of. You don't have to shout, you don't have to explain everything, but you do deserve to be heard, to speak before you're asked, to take up auditory space. Every time you speak your truth, you rewrite the script that said you never could. And that's not just healing, that's revolution. You didn't start out fragmented. You were whole, curious, free. Then came the molding, the subtle shaping of who you were supposed to be loved, to be accepted, to be safe. You took on your father's logic, your teacher's tone, your friend's fashion, your partner's beliefs. And each time you added a piece, you lost a piece, until the reflection in the mirror looked familiar, but not like you. This is the scar of borrowed identity, the quiet crisis that happens when your sense of self is built more on adaptation than authenticity. Psychologists call this identity diffusion, when your personality is a collage of external influences, but you've never truly asked, what do I think? What do I want? Who am I when no one's watching? It's why you feel unsteady around new people, why you morph depending on the room, why you fear solitude, because when the noise stops, the silence feels hollow. You've spent so long being palatable, you forgot what it's like to have taste. Even now, when asked about your passions, your politics, your preferences, you pause. Not because you don't care, but because you're searching for an answer that feels like yours. But here's the truth: you're not lost. You're just layered. Under the expectations, under the masks, under the borrowed voices. There's a version of you that's been whispering all along. Not the loudest, not the cleanest, but the truest. You don't have to burn down the whole persona. Just start peeling, start choosing, start becoming, not someone else, but finally, you. You always sensed when something was about to go wrong. You could feel the tension shift in the room before anyone raised their voice, before anything broke, before anyone admitted they were angry. You became hyper-aware, a human weather vane, picking up on the slightest tone change, the subtlest silence, always bracing for the blow that didn't always come. But when it did, you were ready. This is the scar of anticipatory trauma, when the body prepares for storms, even under clear skies. Because at some point, the storm didn't warn you. It just happened. And that calm before it, the quiet, the nothingness, it became terrifying. You started interpreting peace as danger. You started filling silence with guilt. You started believing, if something goes wrong, it's probably my fault. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a nervous system permanently locked in surveillance mode. Not by choice, but by survival. Because back then, being prepared felt like protection. If you could sense the problem early, you could soften it, redirect it, fix it, even if it was never yours to carry. Now, even when things are calm, your brain says, brace yourself. You mistake safety for suspense. You mistrust joy. You wait for the bad thing, because the good never stayed long. But here's the truth: the storm wasn't your fault. And it's not your job to forecast everyone else's weather. You are not the barometer for chaos. You don't have to live life on high alert. It's okay to trust a good moment, to breathe deeply in stillness, to stop apologizing for simply existing. Not every silence is a warning. Some are invitations to rest. You don't have to flinch when life is kind. Let it be kind. You don't remember the exact moment you started shrinking. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle. A sideways comment, a look that lingered too long, a silence that said more than words ever could. You started avoiding the mirror, not because you didn't care, but because it started to feel like a spotlight on everything that wasn't good enough. This is the scar of shame-infused self-image, where your reflection becomes a courtroom, where your body is a case file, where your worth is always on trial. Psychologists call this internalized objectification, a process where you begin to view yourself the way others judged you, through their eyes, on their terms, and eventually against yourself. You learn to scan for flaws before anyone else could, to joke about yourself first so it wouldn't hurt when they did, to fix things that were never broken just to avoid the look, the pause, the unspoken critique. You called it self-awareness, but really it was self-surveillance. And it didn't just affect your body, it touched your confidence, your creativity, your voice. Because when you spend your life trying to be visually acceptable, you start shrinking the parts of you that can't be seen. But here's the truth. You were never the problem. It was the mirror that was warped, the expectations that were poisoned, the silence that taught you shame. Healing isn't about loving every inch of yourself every day. It's about reclaiming neutrality. It's about being okay with being seen, even in softness, even in change, even in you. You don't owe the world perfection. You don't owe it invisibility either. You're allowed to take up space in mirrors, in rooms, and in your own story. People praised you for being smart, not kind, not creative, not joyful, smart. And it felt good at first, until it became a cage, until every test, every answer, every right thing you said started to feel like currency, proof that you were worth keeping around. You learned to equate being loved with being impressive. You weren't allowed to be confused, or slow, or unsure. You had to know, always. This is the scar of conditional value, where your intelligence became your identity, and your identity became exhausting. Psychologists call this achievement-based self-worth, a dangerous trap where your value is measured not by who you are, but by how well you perform. You feared mistakes like they were betrayals. You hesitated to ask questions because smart people don't need to ask, right? You felt hollow during moments of silence. Because if you weren't producing something valuable, you weren't being anything valuable. Even now, compliments make you suspicious. You wonder if people love you or just the version of you they can quote in a debate. But here's the truth. You are more than your sharpness, more than your logic, more than the perfectly crafted sentences you build to prove your place. You're allowed to say, I don't know. You're allowed to fail. You're allowed to be soft, to be silly, to rest. Your worth is not stored in your brain. It's in your being, your laughter, your presence, your you-ness. You don't have to be brilliant to be beloved. You already are, even when you forget the answer. You were told to be thankful for the roof over your head, for the food on your plate, for the people who meant well. Even if the roof leaked, the food came with shame, and the people left you hurting. You learned early that gratitude was not a feeling. It was a requirement, a rule, a muzzle. Every time you felt angry, sad, or neglected, you heard, "At least you have. Some people have it worse. Don't be ungrateful." So you stopped voicing your pain. You stopped asking for more. You stopped wondering if maybe you deserved better. Because being thankful meant never complaining, right? This is the scar of toxic gratitude, where appreciation becomes a weapon used to invalidate suffering. Psychologists refer to this as emotional invalidation through comparison. It's when your very real struggles are dismissed in favor of keeping you humble, as if gratitude and grief can't live in the same breath. But here's the truth. Gratitude doesn't erase pain. You can be thankful for what you have and still mourn what you didn't get. You can appreciate the meal and still wish someone had asked if you were okay. You can love your family and still feel hurt by them. True gratitude expands you. It doesn't shrink you. It doesn't require silence. It doesn't demand emotional debt. You're allowed to feel lucky and lonely, blessed and broken, grateful and still healing. Because pain doesn't mean you're ungrateful, it means you're human. And healing starts when you stop apologizing for feeling more than one thing at once. You finally said it. No. And the room got quiet. Not peaceful, tense. They looked at you like you'd broken something. Disappointed, cold, withdrawn. So you backtracked, softened it, laughed it off, made yourself small again. Because being uncomfortable felt safer than being unwanted. This is the scar of boundary backlash. The punishment you received, subtle or loud, for finally standing up for yourself. Psychologists call it relational reconditioning, where your nervous system learns that setting limits leads to loss. So you stop setting them and start shrinking instead of asking. You became the yes person, the fixer, the one who never complains, the one who just goes with the flow, even when the flow took you places you never wanted to go. Even now, no feels heavy in your mouth. You rehearse it, edit it, bury it beneath politeness. You feel selfish when you protect your time, rude when you protect your peace, guilty when you protect your truth. But here's the truth. A boundary is not a betrayal. A no is not an attack. Disappointing someone is not the same as hurting them. You are not here to be agreeable. You're here to be whole. And real wholeness requires limits, requires honesty, requires the courage to risk silence in order to find your voice. You don't have to over-explain. You don't have to apologize for needing space. You just have to trust that people who love you for who you are will never leave because of a single word. No. You didn't mean it, but you said it anyway. I'm sorry. Not because you were wrong, but because things felt tense, and tension terrifies people like you. You weren't apologizing for your actions. You were apologizing for your existence, for taking up space, for having needs, for making someone uncomfortable by simply being honest. This is the scar of over-apologizing as a survival strategy. When peace was fragile, you learned to be the glue, even if that meant breaking yourself to keep everything else together. Psychologists call this self-abandonment in conflict resolution, where your nervous system equates confrontation with danger and apology becomes your way out, even when you've done nothing wrong. You said sorry when people bumped into you, when your boundaries were crossed, when you asked for clarification, when you cried. You call it kindness, politeness, being considerate. But deep down, it's fear. Fear that conflict means rejection, that standing your ground means losing your place. And even now, you flinch at disagreement. You feel the urge to smooth things over, to make it okay, even if it was never your responsibility to. But here's the truth. You are not responsible for everyone's comfort. You do not owe an apology for being misunderstood, for expressing pain, for saying no, for existing loudly and honestly. There's strength in humility, but also in boundaries. There's power in apology, but only when it's true. You don't need to make yourself small to keep the room calm. You deserve to take up space, even when it shakes the room a little. There are things you've never said, not out of forgetfulness, but out of protection, not for yourself, but for the ones who hurt you. You minimized it. You said, it wasn't that bad. You convinced yourself, maybe I'm overreacting, because saying the truth out loud meant admitting something wasn't okay. This is the scar of protective silence, a learned loyalty that masks survival. You stayed quiet, not because you weren't in pain, but because the consequences of truth felt worse than the wound itself. Psychologists call this betrayal trauma, when the very people who were supposed to protect you became the threat. And to preserve the relationship, your brain rewired the narrative. You became the peacekeeper, the rationalizer, the secret keeper. Even now, you struggle to name what happened. You downplay the patterns. You hide the details. You protect their reputation, even when it cost you your own healing. You've internalized their shame. And every time you try to speak, a voice inside whispers, don't ruin things. Don't make a scene. Let it go. But here's the truth. Silence doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you lonelier. It doesn't protect them. It protects their ability to hurt others. And you deserve peace that isn't purchased with secrecy. You deserve healing that isn't filtered through guilt. You deserve to tell the story, your story, even if it makes others uncomfortable, even if it changes the way people look at them. Because the first step in reclaiming your power is saying the thing they taught you never to say. It did happen, and it wasn't okay. It was your armor, your disguise, your way of saying, I'm fine, without ever using the words, the smile, polished, perfect, practiced in every mirror, honed through years of pretending. You became the one who lifted the mood, who always laughed, who cracked jokes in silence because silence felt like a spotlight. And if you could keep everyone else comfortable, maybe they wouldn't notice you were falling apart. This is the scar of performative positivity, a survival mechanism forged in places where being okay was easier than being honest, where tears were inconvenient, where vulnerability made people uncomfortable. So you learned to package your pain into something people could like. Psychologists call this emotional masking. It's a form of fawning where your nervous system regulates external chaos by suppressing internal truth. You didn't smile because you were happy. You smiled so no one would look too closely, so they wouldn't ask the hard questions, so they wouldn't walk away, because deep down, you feared that your sadness was a burden. Even now, when someone asks, "Are you okay?" your first instinct is to grin and nod, even when you're not, especially when you're not. But here's the truth. You don't have to be the strong one all the time. You don't have to be the light in the room when your own world feels dark. A smile isn't the proof of peace. And being loved isn't about being pleasant. It's about being real. You are allowed to put down the mask, to cry, to say, "I'm not okay," to be human, fully and unapologetically. The people meant for you will stay when the smile fades. They'll sit with the silence and still choose you. You look back on certain moments and tell yourself they were good. That birthday party, that family trip, that one night you swore was perfect. But when you sit with it, really sit with it, something doesn't feel right. The laughter was strained. The smiles were performed. And under the surface, your nervous system was screaming. This is the scar of nostalgic distortion. When your mind wraps trauma in pretty packaging because it was safer to remember it as good than to accept that it hurt. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance resolution. When two conflicting truths, "I love them and they hurt me," collide, your brain smooths over the cracks to make the world feel consistent again. So you remember the cake, not the silence after the yelling. You remember the hug, not the pressure it came with. You remember the trip, but not the tension that made your stomach ache the whole time. You weren't lying to yourself. You were protecting yourself. Because for a long time, romanticizing survival was the only way to endure it. But here's the truth. You can grieve what happened without erasing what you felt. You can say, "I loved them, but that moment was painful." You can say, "It looked happy, but it cost me something invisible." Healing doesn't mean rejecting your past. It means untangling it, holding it up to the light and saying, "That was beautiful and brutal, and both can be true." You don't owe anyone a sugar-coated story. You only owe yourself the clarity to stop rewriting pain as joy just because you survived it. You weren't born charming. You became charming. Careful, calculated, adaptable. The perfect reflection of what they needed. So you wouldn't be left behind. You noticed their likes, mimicked their tone, laughed when they did, agreed when it made no sense. You crafted a version of yourself that was easier to accept, even if it wasn't really you. This is the scar of adaptive masking, the kind where your identity becomes a mirror, not a window. Psychologists call this false self syndrome. When you shape your personality around approval instead of authenticity, it starts innocently enough. You just want to fit in, to avoid rejection, to survive. But over time, you forget where the performance ends, and you begin. You're the one who's always easy to be around. The chameleon. The friend who can blend into any crowd, but leaves wondering, did anyone actually see me? And now, you're exhausted. Not because you're social, but because you're never fully present. because when you're always shape-shifting, you never feel safe enough to be solid. But here's the truth. You don't have to earn your place by becoming palatable. You don't have to betray your opinions to feel loved. You don't have to wear someone else's personality to be chosen. You are not a costume. You are not a container for other people's comfort. You are allowed to be fully yourself, even if that means fewer people stay, because the ones who remain, they'll be staying for you, not the performance. You stopped expecting people to stay, so you learned to stay ahead of the leaving, to keep things shallow, to laugh things off, to disappear a little before anyone had the chance to walk away completely. You became emotionally low maintenance, easy, chill. You told yourself you were just independent, but the truth? You were scared of getting attached, of being seen, of being abandoned. This is the scar of preemptive detachment, a form of self-preservation disguised as self-sufficiency. Psychologists call it avoidant attachment. It's not that you didn't want connection. You wanted it so badly that the risk of losing it felt unbearable, so you built walls, not to keep people out, but to see who would try to climb them. And when no one did, you said, "See? I knew it." As if that proved you right. As if that made the loneliness easier. You didn't stop trusting others. You stopped trusting yourself to survive the pain if they left. Even now, when someone gets close, you feel the urge to pull away, to test them, to disappear for a bit just to see if they'll come looking. But here's the truth. Not everyone is leaving. Not everyone is temporary. And connection doesn't have to cost your safety. You are allowed to open the door slowly. You are allowed to say, "I'm scared." You are allowed to be soft without losing control. Because love that's real doesn't punish you for having scars. It wraps around them and stays anyway. You didn't build your identity from scratch. You built it from reflections, from what people praised, from what got you approval, from the looks, the nods, the claps. And slowly, without noticing, you stopped asking, "Who am I?" and started asking, "Who do they want me to be?" This is the scar of external validation dependency, when your worth is constructed not from within, but from the reactions of others. Psychologists call this reflected appraisal. It's the process of seeing yourself through the imagined gaze of others. And when those gazes are inconsistent or conditional, your sense of self becomes fragile, shaped by approval, shattered by criticism. You became the overachiever, the peacemaker, the always available friend, not because it felt true, but because it got you love. And when it didn't, you didn't question them. You questioned you. Was I too much? Not enough? What should I fix? Even now, your confidence feels rented, not owned. One wrong look, one cold silence, and your inner voice spirals. But here's the truth. You were not born needing applause. You were taught that love is something to earn, that your reflection is only as beautiful as the mirror you're standing in front of. But mirrors lie. They change with the lighting, with the mood of the room, with the insecurity of the person looking at you. You are not what others reflect. You are what you believe when no one's watching. You are allowed to define your own value, not based on praise, not based on attention, but on your being, on your becoming. You were always 5 steps ahead, planning, predicting, controlling. You called it ambition, they called it drive. But underneath it all was fear. Fear that standing still meant losing ground, that if you let yourself just exist, it would all come crashing down. So you built a future, a perfect one where you'd finally be happy, where the chaos made sense, where the noise in your mind would finally go quiet. This is the scar of futuristic dissociation, a trauma response disguised as productivity. Where the present feels so unsafe, you retreat into what could be, because what is feels unbearable. Psychologists recognize this as a form of temporal escape, a coping strategy where people obsessively fixate on goals, milestones, and imagined outcomes to avoid confronting unresolved pain in the now. You daydreamed about the life where everything was fixed, where you were confident, where they finally understood you, where you never felt small again. You tied your healing to a finish line. If I just get there, I'll be okay. But there kept moving, because healing doesn't wait for an outcome. It demands presence. Even now, your to-do list is longer than your breath. You struggle to rest because stillness feels like failure, and you keep chasing a version of yourself that only exists in someday. But here's the truth. The future doesn't heal you. You do. Right here, right now. Not when everything is perfect, but when you let go of control long enough to feel what you've been avoiding. You don't have to earn peace. You just have to stop postponing it. You thought it was just who you were. Always anxious, always accommodating, always scanning the room for danger, even when no one else could see it. You thought you were overthinking, too sensitive, just bad at trusting people. But what if it wasn't your personality? What if it was conditioning? This is the scar of trauma-wired identity. When your nervous system adapts to survive, and those adaptations become mistaken for character traits. Psychologists refer to this as complex trauma imprinting, a process where repeated exposure to unsafe emotional environments reshapes your core behaviors, beliefs, and identity itself. You became agreeable because resistance led to punishment. You became quiet because speaking up made things worse. You became high achieving because being good was your shield against chaos. And so the world praised your traits while your nervous system carried the cost. Even now, you flinch at normal conflict. You apologize when someone else bumps into you. You people please so instinctively that you forget to ask yourself what you want. And still, you call it your personality. You think it's fixed, that this is who you'll always be. But here's the truth. Personality is not set in stone. It's a living, breathing response to the environments we grow in. And healing, it's not about becoming someone new. It's about unlearning who you had to be to stay safe. You are not your defenses. You are not your hypervigilance. You are not the shape you twisted into to make others more comfortable. You are who emerges when safety does. You kept wondering why the wrong people kept showing up, why they only stayed when you were useful, why they disappeared when you set a boundary, why they seemed to only love the version of you that didn't need anything. This is the scar of self-abandonment as currency. You traded your needs for acceptance, your voice for harmony, your limits for love. And in doing so, you taught people that the only version of you worth staying for was the one who disappeared for their comfort. Psychologists call this relational self-erasure. It happens when love becomes performance and connection becomes a transaction. You don't attract what you deserve. You attract what your nervous system believes is safe. And if you were taught that love means sacrifice, then anyone who demands less will feel suspicious. You fell for people who mirrored your abandonment, who liked that you didn't complain, who praised your independence because it meant they never had to show up fully. Even when they hurt you, you stayed, you rationalized, you said, "It's fine, I can handle it." But here's the truth. The people who benefited from your self-abandonment were never choosing you. They were choosing the version of you that didn't choose herself. And now, you're starting to wake up. You're starting to want more. And that's terrifying, because it means shedding the roles that once kept you safe, even if they were slowly killing your spirit. Let them leave. Let the ones who only loved your silence hear your voice and walk away. Because what's coming next won't demand your disappearance. It will honor your presence. You never asked for much. You were chill. You didn't make drama. You didn't have needs. You were proud of being easy to love. Or at least that's what they told you. But here's the part no one saw. You had needs. You just buried them. Deep. Quiet. Forgotten. This is the scar of emotional minimalism, where expressing desire felt dangerous, so you convinced yourself that needing less was strength. Psychologists call this emotional suppression through adaptive compliance. It forms in environments where asking too much meant receiving too little. Or worse, being punished for asking at all. So you made yourself light, manageable. You said, anything's fine, when it wasn't. You said, I don't mind, when it hurt. And eventually, even you forgot what you needed, because need became shame, and silence became safety. But here's the truth. Being low maintenance is not a personality. It's a response. A survival strategy learned when your needs were met with eye rolls, guilt trips, or cold shoulders. And now, you're left with a relationship resume full of people who loved you most when you asked for the least. People who never knew the real you, because the real you was never allowed to show up. But you are allowed now to want, to express, to say, this matters to me. Because love without room for your needs is not love. It's tolerance. And you weren't made to be tolerated. You were made to be felt fully, fiercely, without apology. You were always working, not just at school, not just at your job, but in relationships, in rooms, in silence, working to be liked, to be needed, to be safe. This is the scar of conditional belonging, where love had prerequisites, where approval felt like a moving target, where rest felt like laziness, because if you weren't proving your worth, you feared it would disappear. Psychologists call this contingent self-worth. It develops when love is inconsistent and you start tying your value to performance. You became the helper, the fixer, the overextender. And when people said, I don't know what I'd do without you, you smiled, but inside you were exhausted. Even now you feel guilty when you're not doing something. You struggle to say no because you think saying yes is what makes you lovable. But here's the truth. You were never supposed to earn your place. Your existence alone is enough. You are not a product. You are not a service. You are not lovable because of what you offer. You are lovable because you are, and the people who deserve to stay. They won't need you to shrink, to give, to exhaust yourself to feel worthy. They'll love you on your quiet days. They'll hold space when you're not helpful. They'll remind you you don't have to hustle for their affection, because real belonging isn't a prize, it's a home. You told yourself you were just mature for your age, that you were strong, that you could handle things other people couldn't. People praised your insight, your calm, your perspective, and you wore it like a badge. But you weren't wise because of years. You were wise because you had to survive too much, too soon. You weren't calm. You were numb. You weren't grounded. You were bracing. This is the scar of forced emotional aging. When trauma makes you grow up before you're ready, and the world mistakes your scars for strength. Psychologists call this parentification, or early emotional role reversal, where children take on adult responsibilities or emotional burdens to keep a dysfunctional system afloat. You became the peacemaker, the secret keeper, the therapist, the one who always had it together. But deep down, you were craving to be held, to be seen, to be told you're allowed to fall apart too. Even now you struggle to ask for help. You dismiss your pain as not that bad. You carry others without expecting to be carried. And you think this is just who you are. Mature, grounded, selfless. But part of you knows it was a mask, a role you slipped into so no one would see how overwhelmed you really were. Here's the truth. Wisdom isn't a wound. It's what comes after the wound has healed. You don't have to keep playing the strong one. You don't have to keep collecting praise for your endurance while slowly falling apart inside. You are allowed to be soft, to be unknowing, to unlearn the stoicism that was never yours to begin with. The world doesn't need your wisdom if it comes at the cost of your wholeness. You got the grade, the job, the body, the win, and for a moment, a brief, electric second, it felt like it meant something. You were proud, validated, maybe even loved, and then nothing. The high faded, the applause stopped, and the silence that followed was louder than the success ever was. This is the scar of hollow achievement, the kind where you keep chasing goals not because you want them, but because you're terrified of what it means if you stop chasing. Psychologists describe this as arrival fallacy, the belief that happiness will come once you get there. But once you arrive, there's always another there, and the emptiness grows. You became addicted to becoming, to being in motion, to staying busy enough that you didn't have to sit in stillness and face the ache underneath. Even now, you can't celebrate your wins for long. You downplay them, move the goalpost, say, it's not a big deal. Because if you ever truly stopped, you'd have to ask, was I doing this for me? Or because I thought it would finally make me feel like enough? Here's the truth. There's nothing wrong with achievement, but when it becomes your only source of identity, it will always leave you hollow, because worth isn't something you reach. It's something you remember, and you were always worthy, even when you hadn't done a damn thing yet. You've had good moments, You've laughed until your ribs ached. You felt peace settle into your bones. You've let yourself hope, but only for a second. Because right after joy came fear. A whisper that said, "This won't last. Don't get used to this. Something bad is coming." This is the scar of joy dysregulation, when happiness feels too risky to hold, because every time you've touched it, life snatched it away. Psychologists call this anticipated loss trauma, the tendency to associate joy with vulnerability, because past pain has trained your body to brace for heartbreak, even in moments of light. So, you dull your celebrations. You downplay the good. You say things like, "Let's not jinx it," or "I don't want to get my hopes up." You think you're being practical. You think you're protecting yourself. But really, you're abandoning yourself before life ever has the chance to. Because if you kill the joy early, you think the pain will hurt less later. Spoiler, it doesn't. Even now, joy makes you flinch. Not because you don't deserve it, but because it feels foreign, untrustworthy. But here's the truth. Joy is not a trap. It's not a setup. It's a birthright. It doesn't need to be justified. It doesn't need to last forever to be worth feeling now. Joy doesn't guarantee safety, but neither does fear. And if something hurts later, you will survive it. But joy, if you let it in, might actually help you live. You weren't lying. You were adapting, shifting, shrinking, sharpening your edges one moment, softening them the next. You watched who got loved most in the room and slowly became them. This is the scar of social mirroring, where your sense of self becomes a patchwork of what was most accepted, not what was most authentic. Psychologists call this identity diffusion, paired with fawning behavior, a response rooted in survival, where you mimic the traits, likes, and needs that seem most palatable, most lovable, most safe. You were a different version of you in every room, funny with the loud ones, quiet with the guarded ones, emotionally available for the broken ones. And the scariest part, they all liked you. Just not the real you. Even now when someone asks, "What do you want?" you freeze. Because you don't always know. Because for so long what you wanted was whatever made other people stay. You wore your masks so well you forgot they weren't your face. But here's the truth. You don't have to earn love by erasing yourself. You don't have to charm your way into safety. You don't have to wear versions of you that make others more comfortable. You are allowed to be complex, messy, contradictory. You are allowed to take up space without explaining who you are or editing yourself to be palatable. Because the love that's real, it won't ask you to perform. It'll wait patiently for you to remember yourself and still be there when you do. You used to lead with your heart, wide open, curious, unafraid, but somewhere along the way, something cracked that part of you, and you learned it was safer to hide. You stopped telling people what you felt, stopped crying in front of anyone, stopped believing that vulnerability was a strength. This is the scar of emotional armor, not the kind made of strength, but of survival, built brick by brick every time softness was punished, mocked, or left unmet. Psychologists frame this as emotional suppression, layered with avoidant attachment. You didn't stop feeling, you just stopped showing. Because when you've been met with rejection for being open, you start to equate love with protection, not connection. So you became composed. You smiled when it hurt. You changed the subject when things got too deep. You said, I'm just not an emotional person, but you were. You are. You just didn't feel safe being seen that way anymore. And even now, when someone tries to get close, you find a way to pull back. Not because you don't want love, but because love means exposure, and exposure feels like risk. But here's the truth. Walls keep pain out, but they also keep you in. The more you numb, the less you feel. And the less you feel, the further you drift from what makes life worth living. You don't have to tear the walls down all at once, but you can open a window, crack the door, let a little light back in, because your softness wasn't the problem. The world just didn't know how to hold it. But maybe now you can. They made your heart race, not in the butterflies kind of way, but in the adrenaline kind. Conversations felt like fire. Highs so intoxicating, you forgave the lows like they were just part of the story. You thought it was passion, but it was chaos, and chaos felt like home. This is the scar of trauma reenactment in love, where you confuse intensity with intimacy because your nervous system has never known the difference. Psychologists refer to this as trauma bonding, a dynamic where emotional volatility becomes addictive. The unpredictability, the tension, the withdrawal, the explosive reconnecting creates a cycle your brain starts to crave. When love was inconsistent growing up, consistency feels suspicious. Safety feels boring. Kindness feels fake. So you chase people who push you away, then pull you close, who love bomb, then ghost, who hurt you, but say the right thing just when you're about to leave. And when you finally find someone stable, you feel restless, like something's missing, like they don't see you, when really they're just not trying to fix you. Because healthy love doesn't trigger survival mode. Here's the truth. It's not passion if it leaves you anxious. It's not chemistry if it costs your peace. Real intimacy is calm, steady, sometimes quiet. It's the safety to be fully seen without needing to earn it, fix it, or chase it. You don't have to keep reliving the fire just to feel warmth. There is love that won't make you burn just to feel alive. You kept ending up in the same place, same arguments, same heartbreak, same ache that made you whisper, why does this always happen to me? Different people, different stories, but the ending always rhymed. This is the scar of unconscious repetition, the compulsion to recreate what hurt us. Not because we want the pain, but because we want a different ending. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion. It's when your mind pulls you back into familiar dynamics in an attempt to resolve past wounds. You're not choosing pain. You're trying to rewrite the past through the present. You date someone who reminds you of the parent who withheld affection, hoping this time you'll be enough. You tolerate disrespect, hoping this time you'll earn love. You stay silent, hoping this time they'll finally notice you're hurt. But here's the paradox. By repeating the pattern, you're not healing it. You're deepening the wound. The mind craves familiarity, even if that familiarity is trauma. And so you label it fate. You say, I guess this is just how love works. Maybe I'm just unlucky. But it's not luck. It's conditioning. And the moment you recognize the pattern, you break its spell. You start choosing people who feel boring at first because they don't spark your anxiety. You start setting boundaries even when it makes you sweat. You start naming your needs before they turn into resentments. And in doing so, you disrupt the cycle. You become the ending you never had. You thought connection meant instant vulnerability. That love meant telling your whole story right away. So you shared the hardest parts first. The trauma, the pain, the chaos. Not because you wanted pity, but because you thought that if someone knew your worst and stayed, then maybe, just maybe, you were finally safe. This is the scar of over-disclosure as a survival tool, where telling everything too soon feels like a shortcut to intimacy, when really it's a test, a plea, a shield. Psychologists call this boundary collapse rooted in trauma, especially for those who grew up feeling unseen, overexposed, or unprotected. When privacy was never respected, you learn to surrender it before someone takes it from you. You became the open book. You said, "I have nothing to hide." But secretly, you hoped someone would say, "You didn't have to share all that. I'm still here." Even now, you blur the line between honesty and self-sabotage. You confuse trauma dumping with trust building. You mistake attention for acceptance. But here's the truth. Vulnerability is powerful, but only when it's protected. Not everyone deserves your story. Not everyone has earned your truth. You don't need to bleed in front of people to prove you're real. You don't have to hand over your soul just to be held. Pacing is not withholding. Privacy is not secrecy. And boundaries, they're what keep your truth sacred, so it isn't trampled by those who never planned to stay. You were always the funny one, the one who broke the tension, who lightened the mood, who turned your own pain into punchlines before anyone could ask if you were okay. People laughed, you smiled, but deep down, you were screaming through your jokes. This is the scar of humor as deflection, a defense mechanism dressed in charm. You weren't trying to deceive anyone. You were trying to survive the spotlight without letting it shine too deep. Psychologists describe this as self-deprecating coping, a way to mask discomfort, to redirect attention away from the wound and onto the punchline. It works until it doesn't. You've been the comic relief in rooms where you were the one hurting most. You've made people laugh about the exact thing that kept you up at night. And when the laughs fade, you're still alone with the ache you never named. Because if you actually opened up, what if it ruined the vibe? What if people saw your sadness and didn't know what to do with it? So you kept being the strong one, the easy one, the funny one. And every time someone said, "You're hilarious, I love your energy," a small part of you whispered, "But would you love my silence?" Here's the truth. Laughter can be healing, but not when it's used to hide the wound. You are allowed to be more than the person who makes others feel better. You are allowed to be serious, to be soft, to have depth that isn't always wrapped in irony. You don't have to be the joke just to be invited to the table. You are enough even when you're not performing. You say you're just like this, that you overthink everything, that you push people away, that you don't do feelings. You joke about your red flags, wear them like accessories. You call it being self-aware, but it's really just being tired of trying to change. This is the scar of trauma that became identity. When pain stays so long, it becomes part of your self-definition. Not just something that happened to you, but something you now believe you are. Psychologists call this identity fusion with trauma. When the defense mechanisms you develop to survive become the way you describe yourself to others, you stop saying, I'm healing, and start saying, I'm just hard to love. But that's not the truth. It's the story pain wrote when you didn't have the words yet to fight back. You're not cold. You're guarded. You're not toxic. You're terrified. You're not emotionally unavailable. You just learned that vulnerability was dangerous. You adapted to a world that didn't protect you by becoming the kind of person who didn't need protecting. And now you're trapped in a version of yourself you never meant to become. But here's the truth. Your personality isn't permanent. You're not a fixed character in someone else's narrative. You're still writing your own. You can outgrow the armor. You can soften without losing strength. You can heal without erasing the survival that brought you here. You are not your coping mechanisms. You are not your past. You are what you choose next. You learned to say sorry before anything even went wrong. Sorry for speaking up. Sorry for needing help. Sorry for being too much or not enough. You apologized for your feelings, your silence, your space. You shrank yourself so others could breathe easier. This is the scar of internalized unworthiness, where your presence feels like a burden unless you're actively proving your value. Psychologists link this to fawn trauma response, a pattern where people-pleasing becomes your survival strategy, not to gain love, but to avoid rejection, to avoid being punished, ignored, or left. So you became hyper-aware. You edited your tone, replayed conversations in your head. You apologized for being late, for being early, for asking questions, for asking nothing at all. And the worst part, the apologies never made you feel safer. They just made you smaller. Even now, when someone tells you they're not upset, you don't believe them. You brace. You wait. You prepare your next apology, just in case. But here's the truth. Existing is not an inconvenience. Taking up space is not a crime. Having needs is not selfish. You don't have to earn your right to be here by making everyone else more comfortable. You are not a problem to be managed. You are not a disturbance to apologize for. You are a person, and that is enough. The only thing you need to say now isn't, I'm sorry. It's, I'm here. And that's something to be proud of. They never said the words, but they didn't have to. You felt it in the way their eyes narrowed when you were too loud, in the sighs when you cried, in the silence when you asked for more. So you became less opinionated, less emotional, less you. This is the scar of conditional acceptance. When love came with terms and fine print, be easy, be grateful, be quiet, or be alone. Psychologists refer to this as conditional regard, when affection is granted only when behavior aligns with someone else's comfort. You learn to scan every room, to read the temperature of a mood before you even entered, to become whoever they needed, because being yourself never felt safe. You called it love, but it was performance. And now, you're tired. Tired of shrinking to be loved. Tired of apologizing for your joy. Tired of asking for so little and still feeling like too much. Even in new relationships, you hesitate to show your full self because deep down, you believe that your realness is a risk. But here's the truth. Love that asks you to disappear was never love. It was control wearing a soft voice. The love you deserve won't punish your emotions. It won't ask you to be smaller. It won't vanish the second you ask to be seen. You are not too much. You were just around people who didn't know how to hold you. And you don't have to disappear to be loved anymore. You get to stay. All of you. You were the smart one, the problem solver, the one who always had the answer. People admired your brain, but rarely asked about your heart. You got praise for your insight, but silence when you needed softness. So you doubled down on thinking and stopped feeling altogether. This is the scar of intellectualization as a defense mechanism, a survival strategy where logic becomes armor. You weren't trying to be cold. You were trying to stay safe. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that vulnerability wasn't productive, that emotions couldn't be trusted, that if you could just understand it, maybe you wouldn't have to feel it. So you explained your grief like a thesis. You analyzed your heartbreak like a math problem. You narrated your anxiety instead of naming it. And people called you mature, wise, composed. But no one noticed how much you were hurting underneath all that insight. Even now, when someone gets too close, you shift the conversation. Quote a study. Make a joke. Say, it's not that deep, even though it always is. Here's the truth. Your intelligence is a gift, but it's not your whole self. You don't have to prove your worth with perfectly structured sentences. Sometimes what you need isn't analysis. It's presence. It's silence. It's someone holding your hand without asking for your opinion. You are not a mind trapped in a body. You are a whole person, and that includes every ache you've tried to explain away. You were always the helper, the caretaker, the one who checked in, showed up, stayed late, and never asked for anything in return. People called you kind, compassionate, selfless, but no one asked how much it was costing you. This is the scar of performative kindness born from fear, when saying yes was safer than setting boundaries, when meeting others' needs became a distraction from your own unmet ones. Psychologists tie this to codependency. When your identity becomes so entangled in being needed that you forget how to just be. You gave so much, but part of you hoped someone would finally say, you don't have to. You can rest. You matter even when you're not useful. But that moment never came. So you smiled harder, gave more, and buried the resentment beneath more generosity. Even now, when someone offers you help, you flinch. You say, I'm good, because receiving feels dangerous, because needing feels like weakness, because you learned that love was safest when it flowed one way, outward. But here's the truth. Kindness without reciprocity isn't virtue. It's a leak. And if you keep pouring yourself out without ever being filled back up, eventually you run dry. You are allowed to ask, to need, to rest, to say no. Your worth is not measured in sacrifices made quietly. It's measured in the wholeness you allow yourself to become. You are not here to be the emotional janitor of everyone's mess. You are here to be free, even if that means not being everyone's favorite. You kept looking to them for clarity, for proof you were lovable. Enough. Good. You gave them the mirror and waited for a reflection that made you feel whole. But all they gave you was distortion. This is the scar of outsourced self-worth. When your identity depends on someone else's gaze, not because you're weak, but because you were never taught how to hold a mirror of your own. Psychologists trace this to mirroring theory, the idea that our sense of self is built by how we're reflected by others in early life. If you were only praised when you performed, only noticed when you pleased, only loved when you were small, then of course you learned to hand out the mirror and say, "Please tell me who I am." And sometimes they told you, but the image was warped. They said you were too much, too needy, too intense, too soft. So you tried to adjust the angles, change your posture, fix your face. You thought if you could become what they wanted, you'd finally feel at peace. But here's the truth. The people who see you clearly will never ask you to disappear. They won't confuse honesty with drama or sensitivity with weakness. They will reflect you back in ways that feel like recognition, not rejection. But first, you have to take the mirror back. You have to learn the shape of your own truth without waiting for someone else to approve it, to say, "This is me," even if you don't clap, even if you walk away, because the right people won't hand you a funhouse mirror. They'll sit beside you as you learn to love your reflection, finally, fully, as your own. You were the unbothered one, the one who didn't care, who ghosted first, laughed things off, acted like nothing ever touched you. People called you mysterious, low maintenance, emotionally chill. But inside, you were aching for connection. You just didn't know how to reach for it without looking weak. This is the scar of defensive detachment, a mask made of distance, a strategy born from rejection, where not caring feels safer than not being cared for. Psychologists link this to dismissive avoidant attachment, where vulnerability feels threatening and closeness sets off alarms. So you kept things light, played it cool, told yourself you were better off alone than misunderstood. But the truth is, you weren't emotionless. You were protecting the softest part of you from being seen and abandoned. Even now you feel a pang when people post about found family or soul-deep friendships. But you scroll past. Tell yourself you're just built different, that needing people is for other people. But here's the truth. Indifference isn't peace. Isolation isn't strength. And your silence isn't proof that you're fine. It's okay to want more, to miss what you never had, to grieve the closeness that felt just out of reach. Letting someone in won't make you weak. It'll make you real. And that's worth everything. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just shut down. Because sometimes silence isn't peace. It's protection. It's exhaustion. It's the last defense when words feel useless. This is the scar of emotional shutdown, when conflict or overstimulation makes the nervous system collapse into stillness, not because you don't care, but because it feels like the only safe option left. In trauma psychology, this is called the freeze response. It's what happens when fight or flight aren't possible, when running doesn't work and speaking risks more pain. So you go quiet, you numb, you disappear inside your own body. You learned it young, maybe from a volatile home, maybe from a world that punished your expression. You figured out that staying silent kept you from being targeted, blamed, or broken further. So now you don't raise your voice, you raise your walls. Even in relationships, when things go wrong, you go mute. Not because you don't have thoughts, but because you've already rehearsed how they'll be dismissed. And in that silence, you tell yourself, it's not worth it. They won't understand anyway. It's safer to say nothing at all. But here's the truth. Silence shouldn't be the price you pay for love. Stillness shouldn't be your only shield. And disappearing shouldn't be your only way to feel safe. Your voice still exists, even if it's buried. It still matters, even if it trembles. And it deserves to be heard, even if it's only a whisper at first. You used to fall for the same traps, the guilt trips, the subtle digs, the promises laced with control. But something shifted. You pause now. You breathe. You recognize when someone's trying to pull your strings, and you don't dance for them anymore. This is the strength of post-traumatic growth, the quiet, invisible transformation that happens after you've crawled your way out of emotional survival. Not with fireworks, but with clarity. Psychologists call this cognitive restructuring. It's when the mind, after being bent by pain, learns to see the game for what it is and refuses to play. You no longer mistake criticism for care, silence for safety, love for ownership. You spot manipulation mid-sentence. You recognize projection in someone else's anger. You hear the unspoken warning in someone's too sweet tone. Not because you're paranoid, but because you've been here before. And now, you know the exits. The people who once confused you now look obvious. Their tactics, the love bombing, the gaslighting, the subtle power plays, all feel predictable. That's not cynicism. That's wisdom. And here's the wildest part. You're still kind, still open, still soft. But now you're also sharp. You won't beg. You won't shrink. You won't hand over your intuition just to keep someone around. You've healed. Not perfectly, but deeply enough to know that peace is more important than attention. That freedom feels better than approval. That self-trust is your loudest truth. You felt everything. The tension in someone's voice, the weight in their silence, the storm behind their smile. You absorbed people's pain like a sponge. You called it empathy, but it left you drained. This is the scar of hyper-empathy without boundaries. When your heart becomes a landing pad for emotions that were never yours to carry. Psychologists recognize this as empathic distress fatigue, the emotional exhaustion that comes from feeling too much, for too long, for too many people without a space to release it. You thought caring meant sacrificing your peace, so you held space for everyone, even those who never held space for you. You gave second chances like candy. You stayed in conversations that drained you. You made excuses for people who hurt you because you understood them. And when you finally broke, you apologized for it. Because deep down, you thought being a good person meant never saying enough. But here's the truth. Empathy isn't meant to be a wound. It's meant to be a bridge, not a cage. You are allowed to walk away from people you still care about. You are allowed to feel someone's pain without making it your own. You are allowed to protect your energy even if it disappoints someone else. Empathy without boundaries isn't compassion. It's self-abandonment. You are not their therapist. You are not their emotional sponge. You are not a mirror for their grief. You are a person, and you deserve peace too. People said you were so composed, so chill, so unbothered, but they didn't see how hard you worked to feel nothing at all. This is the scar of emotional detachment mistaken for peace, a response to a life that made feeling unsafe. So you shut it all down. Psychologists frame this as emotional numbing, a trauma response where your nervous system doesn't know the difference between safety and silence. You weren't calm. You were disconnected. You weren't grounded. You were frozen. When you smiled through disappointment, laughed through betrayal, said, "I'm fine," and meant, "I don't know what I feel anymore." It's not that you don't care. It's that caring became exhausting. And now joy feels muted, love feels distant, grief feels like static. But here's the truth: numbness is not peace. It's a pause, a place you land when life asks too much, too fast. You deserve more than emotional survival mode. You deserve to feel again, in color. Not all at once, not without fear, but gently, steadily, honestly. Feeling is not failure, it's freedom. You learned to read people's moods like survival depended on it. The twitch of an eyebrow, the shift in someone's tone, the silence that lasted half a second too long. You became fluent in the language of tension, a master of subtext, of walking on eggshells without anyone ever asking you to. This is the scar of hypervigilance disguised as emotional intelligence. Not intuition, but conditioning. Not empathy, but anticipatory defense. Psychologists refer to this as a form of complex trauma response, where the nervous system is always scanning for danger, even in calm moments. Especially in calm moments. You didn't wait to be told something was wrong. You felt it in the air. You beat people to the apology. You said things like, "I know you're mad," before they even said a word. And when they said they weren't, you didn't believe them. You thought it meant you were emotionally intelligent, in tune, wise. But what you really were was afraid. Afraid of anger, afraid of conflict, afraid of being blindsided again. And so you kept performing, soothing, preemptively repairing things that hadn't even broken. But here's the truth. Not every silence means danger. Not every expression needs decoding. Not every shift in tone is your responsibility to fix. You don't have to be a mind reader to stay safe anymore. You can ask. You can wait. You can trust that love isn't always a puzzle you have to solve before it turns on you. Sometimes silence really is just silence. And peace, it's not a trap. It's your nervous system finally learning what safety feels like. You were finally out of the chaos, out of the yelling, the guilt trips, the walking on eggshells. There was no more conflict, but somehow you still weren't calm. You told yourself this was peace, but it wasn't. It was just the absence of noise. This is the scar of emotional numbness, mistaken for healing. When your nervous system has been so overstimulated that quiet feels like safety, even when it's just emptiness. Psychologists call this emotional blunting, a state where the body and brain shut down emotional responsiveness, not because you're healed, but because you're exhausted. You say you've moved on, but you still flinch at sudden kindness. You still mistrust good days, waiting for the rug to be pulled. You don't cry, but not because you're strong, because you've forgotten how. And the scariest part, you start convincing yourself this is what better feels like. But here's the truth. Peace is not just quiet. Peace is not just surviving. Peace is presence. It's the ability to feel again, without fear that those feelings will destroy you. You are allowed to want more than just the absence of harm. You are allowed to outgrow numbness. You are allowed to heal loudly. Your silence kept you safe, but your voice will bring you home. You had a plan for everything, contingencies, backup plans, safety nets tucked under every decision. People said you were responsible, strategic, disciplined, but beneath it all was fear. This is the scar of hypercontrol as protection, where every detail must be managed, not for efficiency, but for survival. Psychologists link this to anticipatory anxiety and trauma-linked perfectionism. You weren't trying to be obsessive, you were trying to prevent pain. You learned early. If you prepared well enough, no one could hurt you. If you got it right the first time, no one would criticize. If you expected the worst, you'd never be caught off guard. So you ran simulations in your mind. What if they don't text back? What if they leave? What if you fail? And everyone sees it. Even joy came with conditions. You couldn't fully feel it because what if it didn't last? And now you're exhausted, not from the planning, but from holding up a world that was never meant to be perfectly managed. Here's the truth. Control isn't safety. It's an illusion that mimics safety. Real safety is trust in yourself, in your capacity to adapt, in the fact that you can survive the unknown, not avoid it. You don't need to see 5 steps ahead to take the next one. You can let go, not because everything is certain, but because you'll figure it out even if it's not. There was a time when you raised your voice, when you cried out, protested, explained, but no one listened. They minimized, ignored, mocked. So you stopped. Now, silence is your survival language. When you're hurt, you say nothing. When you're overwhelmed, you disappear. When someone crosses a line, you make excuses for them instead. This is the scar of learned silence, where speaking up once cost too much, so you trained yourself to flinch inward instead. Psychologists associate this with selective mutism in trauma responses, not in a literal sense, but in the emotional way your body learns to mute itself just to avoid being shamed for existing too loudly. And it works. You get through the day. People say you're chill, low maintenance, easy to be around. But what they're really saying is, you don't inconvenience me. You don't ask for too much. And inside, you're carrying full conversations no one will ever hear. You're swallowing truth like poison and calling it peace. But here's the truth. Silence may protect you, but it also isolates you. And over time, it becomes a wall so high, even you forget what your voice sounds like. So let this be your permission to speak, to disrupt, to correct someone when they get it wrong, to tell your story not for validation, but for you. You don't have to scream. You just have to stop disappearing.